So, my partner in crime.
I'm just here for, the odd remark and comedy.
So,
you did notice that we've actually arranged the clouds here to come to London specifically today. That was a lot of prep work.
Yeah. It's not like in Russia where you get the jet fighters sprinkle out pixie dust to remove the clouds. We actually had to do the opposite here. So, how many of you are on Office 365 today? How many of you are thinking about Office 365? Which plan? So, is it a real tenant or is it a test tenant? Real tenant? Test tenant? So, how many of you are confused about all the different plans that we have for Office 365? So, we have some slides on the different plans. We won't spend too much time on them. We just want to highlight some of the differences. And actually, it is quite, sometimes it's overwhelming to look at the different things. But actually, the flexibility it provides to organizations is actually pretty good, because you can then, as a customer, figure out what are the things that you want to use. So which of your users needs which type of plans. So it actually gives you the flexibility. But again, with flexibility comes complexity. So anyway. So again, just a quick overview. So what is Office 365? At the end of the day, we heard it loud and clear from our customers in the past that actually the way that we're doing major server releases every 3 years and major client updates every 3 years is not a model that we can continue using, because it's just too disruptive. So what we wanted to do is, in a way, provide some of those core capabilities managed by us from our cloud to organizations of any size. So we actually have two flavors of Office 365. We have the public Office 365, and then we have the Office 365 dedicated plan. So you don't hear that much talk about the dedicated plan, and the main reason for that is that the dedicated plan typically targets large customers with, typically the sweet spot is 25,000 seats and above. And so we have a service like that, and we actually have, it's the older of these services. We've had customers on that service for actually 3 versions of SharePoint. Our first one was Energizer in the US. We actually started hosting their SharePoint 2003, and then we upgraded them to 2007, and now we've upgraded them to 2010. And actually soon we'll upgrade them to 15. So again, we have that offering, and it's more, you can think that as a premium SKU, it is available, but today's talk will focus on the public Office 365. Since this is a SharePoint conference, we won't spend that much time on Exchange Online or Link Online, but the thing that I have to say as a SharePoint architect, I hate the Exchange guys, because their life is so easy. Because Exchange is really, really cloud ready. So Exchange is a product where you can say, oh, if you have an Exchange 2010 installation, you can say, well, I want to move a mailbox to the cloud. You just say a move request, everything works. The end user doesn't even notice that the mailbox moves. Then we talk about SharePoint migrations, then it's pain and misery, right? So.
Yeah, it is worth bearing this in mind, though, as SharePoint professionals. We in the journey to the cloud, we are inevitably going to have to be more exposed to things like Exchange, Link, Active Directory, and so on. They've always been important, but they become even more important that we understand the core concepts of those other products. And it's entirely feasible over time, that there'll be some more boxes on this slide, over the long haul.
Yeah, and then, so again, Office 365, the other interesting thing is actually there's not a special Exchange or SharePoint version that we run in the cloud. It is the same SharePoint version that we run on premises. And the benefit of that approach is that actually all of the improvements that we make because of our discoveries on our hosting journey will benefit the on-premises customers as well.
Yeah, it's probably the biggest improvement in terms of how the product is built, etc., is the experience of hosting Office 365. All of that goodness is being baked into the product, and we can benefit from that as well.
Yeah, and it's not always been a how should I say, a smooth ride. So I worked 2 years in the SharePoint Online team, and it was actually interesting seeing how different it is to manage a service compared to build a product. So what we're seeing now is that the learnings that we've made is actually feeding back. And a lot of those things will actually improve, not necessarily the feature sets for the end users, but what they do impact is the feature sets for management and operations, so things that IT pros typically care about. So again, the plans. So we have multiple different plans. So we have the Office 365 plans for professionals and small businesses called the P plan. And then we have the ones that are more probably interesting to our audience is the mid-sized business and enterprise. And then we also are releasing an education plan. So we're moving from Live at EDU to Office 365 for education. So we are moving everyone underneath the Office 365 umbrella. And the other interesting thing, if you think of it, so today we're making a large percentage of our revenue from Office 365 comes from companies with less than 50 seats. So you have to bear that in mind. So we have to design a service that can cater the needs of a small company, but can also scale to the needs of schools that might have 1 million students or alumni. So it's all using the same provisioning framework, the same product. So it's actually quite an ambitious goal. So again, the people, I'll quickly go through this. So again, this is for the small companies that you actually, for those ones who don't have their own IT staff. So it's for people who want to get email calendaring, a basic website, and then just instead of running them in their own environment, they can just purchase that for a reasonable fee from us. And this is where I never engage with these because typically my hourly rate is too high. So again, this is for the, but again, we have a large number. And if you think of it, if an organization has 25, or I would actually argue that an organization going up to 50, what's the business case of deploying a SharePoint environment for an organization that's small? Do they have the skills? Does it make sense for them to do it? Probably not, right?
Yeah, and how are you going to make that available, when they're away from the office? They might not even have an office, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. It is worth pointing out understanding these plans is key from a consulting perspective, of course, but this one is interesting because the bottom bullet here, hard limit at 50 users is pretty important, especially if we think about I'm involved in a new business based in Edinburgh, which 6 months ago had 7 employees. Tomorrow, it will have 26 employees. And, that growth is going to continue in that fashion. But they also want to enable access into this environment to their business partners, who are banks and other financial institutions. So that's definitely worth considering that hard limit is not just the employees, as it were, it's everybody that you want to be able to access the sites and so forth.
So again, features. An ironic thing, if you remember in the past, we used to say, don't send attachments, store them in SharePoint. Now, today we're offering, what Exchange did for version 2007, they actually improved their disk I/O performance dramatically. So you can now run Exchange on cheap storage. So now we can offer 25 gig mailboxes on Exchange, and we offer 500 megs of SharePoint storage per user. So it's kind of funny. Now you should actually send attachments because it's better use of storage. It'd
be interesting to know what the guys in the adoption tracks are saying about that, right?
Yeah. And again, so the feature set's active sync. So again, for all the different type of devices, you can get access to your Exchange environment. Link, Office web applications. But again, the one which is probably more interesting for us are the E plans. So where you actually you get Office Professional Plus, you get the capabilities of synchronizing with your on-premises Active Directory, and you can have Exchange archiving. So you can define policies on your Exchange environment that actually will automatically archive things. And here the choices are, so we have a lot of customers who are purchasing this as part of their enterprise agreement, so you get annual contracts, but you can also choose to purchase it on a monthly basis. The monthly basis would be a good scenario if you, for instance, need to increase your head count during the Christmas period or during the summer period. You just then purchase more licensing during that period, and when you don't need them anymore, you just sort of reduce the number of licenses.
Key thing with this one as well, of course, is you actually have somebody at the end of the on the end of a phone or link call to be able to speak to if you get into problems with the environment, which of course isn't available with the previous plan.
Yeah. So some other things that we get then, so there's an E1 plan where you get certain capabilities, there's an E2 plan where you get more capabilities, and the main thing actually is the changes is that for the E1 plan, you can consume information using Office Web Applications. With the E2 plan, you can also contribute on information. So in essence, an E1 is a read-only experience for users using Office Web Applications. E2 is read-write. That's the major difference between those plans, looking at this from the SharePoint point of view. Then we go to the next one, which is, well, if you do a trial tenant in Office 365, this is the plan that you will get. So this is the rich one where you actually get enterprise features, so you can do things like Excel services and a bunch of other things.
Yeah, this one's a key feature here is the in-place records management, right? So this is the plan. If that's important to you, this is the plan you need to be able to do that.
And also with this plan, you get actually the Office bits. So you can then download the bits from the website and install them. E4, you actually get more exchange capabilities, you get legal holds and things like that. So usually the customers I deal with, they have a mixture of plans because again, not everyone needs all the full capabilities. So you remember in the past it was really hard in SharePoint. You couldn't really deploy a SharePoint environment in a way that you would say that 80% of my users get the standard features and 20% get the enterprise features. It was all or nothing. So again, with Office 365, you can say that if I have a large number of sort of content consumers, I'll just purchase the necessary licenses for them. And then for the real information workers who are creating content, I'll purchase a better license for them. So it provides you the flexibility.
And that could be a significant cost saving for the business as well. If you think about the idea of a standard desktop, which has got a standard set of tools on, generally the way those are deployed is everybody gets the same stuff and therefore it has to be licensed. And in most large enterprises, the vast majority of users are not using, the rich, they're not editing content so much, they're more consuming it. So again, the ability there to have that flexibility means especially if you're like a manufacturing organization where you may have a lot of factory staff who are simply reading manuals and so on rather than actually actively contributing, can be a significant cost saving.
I probably should sign out of Skype. So, anyway. So again, another thing is that these plans do change. So it may be that in 6 months' time we'll actually change those. So one thing that we did, the recent change, we actually introduced more capabilities into the low-end plans. So we actually introduced active sync also for like the content consumers, because we realized that today, like the bring your own device metaphor is actually becoming a fact of life. So we just had to have a way where we could provide active sync integration also for the low-end users. Kiosk ones, so again, these are then the content consumers. So what they will get is place to go and read stuff. They get email, they get Outlook web access, they get access to team sites, but again, it is the kiosk users who are not having an Office client, they're just using a browser to do their main part. And then we have the K2. Again, so again, there are plans, and we actually revised them based on the input from the field. And the other interesting thing, if you look at Office 365, so as I said, in the past, we used to release a product every 3 years. And then you had to go through a painful upgrade and whatnot. So in the cloud, we can't actually have the cloud moving at a 3-year life cycle. So what we do in the cloud is actually we have this thing that we call service updates, so SUs. So it is the way that we actually upgrade the environment. So it doesn't mean that we're upgrading the bits necessarily. It may mean that we actually go from certain cumulative updates to a later version. It also could mean, what it typically means is that we actually add more capabilities. So in the case, for instance, when we shipped Office 365, we had a limitation for SharePoint that you couldn't import more than 20,000 user objects. So was there a product limitation? No. And so did we do any product improvements to sort of be able to increase this limit now to 500,000? No. The main thing that we did was we had enough testing data so that we knew that it actually works.
Yeah, so it's a service improvement rather than the functional improvement, right? There's confidence, there's a confidence level to be able to offer this and be able to be comfortable with being able to do that across the piece, not just in SharePoint, but all of the other elements that impact that.
And some other things that we introduced, again, the thing that we introduced with Service Pack 1, so the site collection recycle bin. You can imagine in a cloud service, the ability of providing a recycle bin is so critical because, again, each time we have to do a support call to restore something, it costs money. So the more we can do self-service, the better. So we introduced the site collection recycle bin. And we also worked with Adobe to get a better version of the reader out there so that actually that would work better with SharePoint. So we actually take the feedback and then we're introducing new features. And the last one is interesting also, it's the Easy ID support. So for those of you who played with the betas, we actually had support for Easy ID. Anyone, do you know what an Easy ID is? So an Easy ID is an Easy ID. No, well, no. So when we RTM'd Office 365, if you wanted to invite external users, you could do that by inviting them using their live ID or Hotmail ID. So the challenge with that was that you had to create a live ID, which is not that difficult, but then the live team actually did not like to have people just creating live IDs just for the sake of accessing SharePoint, because whenever you create a live ID, behind the scenes you will get a SkyDrive, you will get a Hotmail account and all of that. So Easy ID is actually conceptually the same thing. You'll get a way to authenticate against the SharePoint Online environment, but you don't get the Hotmail mailbox, you don't get the SkyDrive storage. And also with the Easy ID, you can just define whatever email address as your user sort of login as well. So again, it made it easier for us to then invite external users into the environment. So far we've had 2 service updates to the product, and the way that we actually do these things is we have an internal 12 to 18 months roadmap of what are the things that we will do. Then we actually are tracking information from our partners, from our field, from our support and all, and then we sort of identify what are the top feature requests or what are the top support issues that we're seeing, and then we're trying to see that if we can remediate them, if we can light up new functionality, and then we'll publish the quarterly service updates. So it's actually an improvement. So again, what you won't see, but what will happen is, for instance, when SharePoint, the next version of SharePoint will ship, we will then start to actually automatically upgrade the SharePoint environments so that you will get a notification that your environment will be upgraded, but there should be minimal impact on that. And again, the question, will we release Office 365 with the full capabilities of the new product? We don't know yet. But again, our sort of quarterly service update release allows us to add more functionality whenever we need them. Any questions on this? So, yeah.
I know this Office 365 stuff is new, but I'm always interested in the relationship of the back office client and the E4 Midsize, of how that sits in that model.
You mean the quarterly release cycles or in general?
Whether it has, whether there's going to be any. I'm particularly interested in sort of where Microsoft's back client sitting with Wave 15 and beyond. How much longer do we expect to have a back office client?
That's a good question. So again, in reality, the Office client, a rich client, actually provides more capabilities. So you'll get added benefits of having a client application. Obviously, we will continue pushing like lightweight clients and like with Windows 8 on ARM and then with the browser. So the browser clients will evolve. But again, Office is such a key piece of it. So the main challenge that I see in the future is making sure that, well, what is the sort of a dependency between the server versions and the client versions? Because that's the key thing, because if we're introducing hard dependencies, it'll make upgrades difficult. But again, it's hard to sort of create an Office client today that's sort of fully future-facing. So again, if we're adding new capabilities, someone comes up with a new way of doing things, and we implement that in, let's say, SharePoint 16. So there's no way that Office 2010 client can know about that. So there will always be the same paradigm. You'll have the richest user experience if you have the latest. But again, we know that it's not realistic to expect that when we move to the cloud, where we're actually updating the service quite often, that the customers we can't require them to constantly update their desktops in the same pace.
Yeah, I think it's certainly fair to say that there will be more features in future versions of the rich clients that will make the interaction with the cloud services easier. So I don't think it's going away anytime soon. That's certainly not the case, and that it will be a more integrated experience over time. And indeed that's what we need, because this whole sessions today now are talking to Office 365 in the public cloud, but all of these technical capabilities, whether they're implemented in 365 or on in the rich clients, could potentially benefit our on-premise deployments as well. So fully expect continued significant, enormous investment in the rich clients and newer capabilities. Because there are just some things that you need that experience in order to do. If you think about the kind of, even something as simple, and with something that we're quite familiar with, right? Offering these slides. Me and Kimmo could have been working together using, the PowerPoint web app and so on, but, when it starts coming to things like the builds and a lot of the more complex, if you like, capabilities of PowerPoint, then, we have to have the response as well as the user interface model, which really can only be provided in a rich client.
But what I think will happen is that we'll see more like the divide of people into two groups. So we have the content creators who need those things, and then we have the content consumers for whom the browser is the browser or the device is the key thing.
Because if you think about the introduction of the ribbon with the last release of Office, the primary reason for that was it wasn't the sort of ideal design model of some UX designer somewhere. There was customer data proved that most customers only knew about 7% of the features in the product, and so there's definitely that divergence where many people want a vastly simplified environment to be working with, and there's far more of those people than the people who want the advanced features.
Yeah.
I think that's the key.
Yeah.
Yeah, and with the ribbon, again, people don't like change, right? So the best way of sort of notice that, so if you go to your in-laws and on a dinner table, your father-in-law typically sits in this chair, right? Just go and sit in that chair and see what happens. People don't like change. So again, the ribbon was a great thing. So actually it'd be kind of funny now to introduce Clippy back, because now we have the horsepower to actually do that.
It looks like you're trying to move to the cloud. Would you like help with that?
Yes. So anyway, so if you look at then the architecture of SharePoint in the cloud. So again, our SharePoint farm. So again, we will always have for the customers, we'll have two data centers. So we'll have the primary and the secondary data center. So, and again, the reason for that is, so if something happens in Amsterdam, we can fail over to Dublin, or if Dublin runs out of Guinness, we can fail over back to Amsterdam anyway. So, but within those farms, we will have a web application per farm. And within that web application, we'll have X number of tenants. So at the moment, I think our scale unit is that we'll will host 250,000 users per SharePoint farm, and then when we get close to that limit, we'll actually then provision a new farm. And all the farm provisioning is fully automated. And another interesting thing is that we actually never patch our environments. People go, what? So we don't. But what we will do is we'll actually provision a new farm next to it on the new patch level, and then we just move the content databases across and upgrade the content databases.
It's actually a much quicker way of applying
Yes.
operating system updates and so on.
Yeah. And so when we did the service update 2, and within that process we actually we jumped over to a quite new recent cumulative update level, and the downtime, or actually not the downtime, but the read-only time for the users were 7 minutes. Because everything happens automated. We have a bunch of logic that knows that this particular tenant exists in this database, or like this database contains these tenants, and okay, we'll mark them as read-only, and we copy over the database upgrade, and then when the upgrade is done, we'll just reroute them because we have logic in front of SharePoint that actually dictates and tells us where the data is. So again, looking at the SharePoint part of it, so as I said, within the farm we have one application. Within that web application we store X number of tenants, and each tenant will get X number of site collections. So again, there's certain fixed URLs that we have. So the first one, so your sites will always be, your internet sites will always be with a URL that https yourtenantname.sharepoint.com. Your my sites will be the same concept where your tenant name and then -my.sharepoint.com. And then your administration will be, again, tenant name and admin. Again, you can have one host header site collection for brochure type websites. Again, those websites aren't the ones where you would create a Ferrari.com and anything like that. They're just simple brochureware type of sites where we have a specific tool that you can use to sort of surface HTML data in essence.
Yeah, simple brochure style sites for the smaller business, right? Just before we move on, the other thing that's interesting here is that all of this provisioning, as Kimmo mentioned, is automated and is using the same capabilities that we have in the on-premise version for tenancy, but there's not a, Kimmo deliberately said, an X number of tenants, right? The definition of the size of the farm, if you like, is the number of users, not the number of tenants. So it's not like a farm can do 20 tenants or 200. It's purely, from a performance perspective, driven by the number of users.
Yeah.
And all of this configuration is driven by the automation code is quite interesting, because you can imagine this is going to be quite a busy data center. It's quite a significant amount of complexity. And a lot of these choices are made because of the need to be able to do it via automation. And so there'll be definite design decisions behind the scenes here that we would, if we were going to take the multi-tenancy capability and do it for a private cloud or a smaller deployment, we would do something vastly different. So it's not one model fits all. And again, it's another example of how the service, the management and operational service availability of the product drives the decisions made rather than the functionality.
And then, like, these are the way that we also build the farms. So the Office 365 SharePoint farms always have a services farm, and then we have X number of content farms. And then we have deployed the service applications, obviously, in partition mode, and then connecting them to the web application in each farm. So that's and then when we do major upgrades, then we do planning that we do the content farms first, service farms. But again, it's very well orchestrated, and it's, again, there's no human involvement. Everything's automated. And for a reason, because we actually, in our data centers, I think the number of servers running Office 365 at the moment, I think it's closer to 120,000 servers. So you don't really have people who go insert disk, next. So everything has to be automated. So then the other thing, so the way that we actually provide storage, so we actually, when you sign up for Office 365, each user will get 500 megs of storage And it's pool storage, so if you have 100 users, you'll get 100 times 500 megs. If that's not enough, you can actually purchase up to 25 terabytes of data. And I think that the price at the moment is 20 cents per gigabyte per month. I think that price is coming down, but I can't promise. So by default, the total number of site collections is 300, but it can be increased to 10,000. Again, the 10,000 site collections thing came with Service Update 2, so we added more capabilities. Again, we still like to limit the maximum number of size of a site collection because performance reasons and following SharePoint best practices.
Yeah, again, that's a management consideration driving that, and it's a sensible number anyway, right? The whole conversation about having 2 terabyte site collections is a little bit ridiculous if you think about how users store files, which is what this is all about. So.
Yeah. And also, so in our environment, so we, in a way, we build them using, for storage-wise, we use like airline booking in the sense that we don't provision all the storage up front, and because it would be kind of pointless to have empty storage just waiting there. So what we have in place is monitoring software that realizes that, well, actually, in our farm, we need to get more storage, so then we'll just automate another storage group to be added into that farm. Again, the key thing is to run the environments with enough capacity, not too much, not too little. So again, if you compare the capabilities, so obviously with an on-premises environment, you get the full capabilities of doing whatever you want. But again, then the cost and the risk is on your side. So if you look at the sort of key workloads in SharePoint, so for basic collaboration thing, you get most of the functionalities in the cloud. You don't get web analytics, but again, that's typically not a huge issue for most customers anyway.
Yeah, and some of the other things where where it's more limited, are inherent in terms of what they're doing. If you think about something like business intelligence, it's actually, from a technical perspective, if you want to integrate easily with, internal line of business data systems, that's going to be a significant risk, and it should be fairly obvious as to why there's limited capability there. Similarly, something like a record center, based on the previous, the discussion on the previous slide, we wouldn't want to be doing an extremely large archive scenario in this type of environment for obvious reasons.
And then, so another thing, so we do offer BCS connectivity now with Service Update 2, but it is BCS against the WCF endpoints only.
Yeah.
So again, that means that you can actually integrate things within SharePoint that actually can talk to your own premises, but you'll usually then use things like Azure or other means to do that. So again, and another key thing is on the last one, so like no full trust code allowed. And there's many reasons why that's not allowed in the cloud. And one of the key reasons is the fact that full trust code, when you deploy that to a farm, is actually available to all of those tenants within that farm. So there's no way that you could limit that only these tenants could use this full trust solution. That's one thing, but the key driver for not allowing that is actually full trust code typically makes upgrades painful because you're introducing a dependency on a custom solution that needs to be remediated before you do the upgrade.
Yeah, of which SharePoint has no knowledge whatsoever.
Yeah.
And certainly in that, in that space, and we'll get more into this when we bring those crazy people from next door in after lunch. But in this world, the full trust code world, we really should be considering other cloud deployment options for that, functionality anyway, and that's, the Azure side of things, which provides, or, another cloud provider service, which is a more appropriate deployment model for a lot of that type of customization. Not all of it, of course, but for certainly line of business type applications is the right choice.
Another thing that's worth pointing out is enterprise search. The cloud is an island. in the sense that, well, there's no search engine today that can crawl the cloud. So if you have an on-premises search environment, you cannot crawl the cloud. And the other way around, from the cloud, obviously you cannot crawl your on-premises environment. Because again, our crawlers run using our Microsoft credentials, and it's not very likely that you would expose your internal line of business systems or repositories to our accounts. And actually, we wouldn't even want that. It's not the technical thing, it's the potential liability issue.
Yeah. No cloud provider, well, I wouldn't say no cloud provider, no credible cloud provider would want to be in the business of storing, valuable customer data in that fashion.
So you can do federated search in a way that you'll have from an on-premises you could do a federated search against the cloud. So, but you wouldn't get like one single index, you'll just get two things. So again, it is a thing that actually complicates your information architecture somewhat. But again, but that's only the case if you actually have the need of actually searching both of those environments. So there are improvements being made in the future releases to make those things. But actually, this is not so much it is a technical challenge, but it's also a political thing, and also trying to then how can we guarantee that we can build something that's scalable and sustainable and that can go outside of the control of our environment.
It's also a key planning consideration for us in our journey to the cloud to understand, which content should be where. And these restrictions are one of the many things that will drive that. And that's something that certainly inside a large enterprise is a big challenge to understand what the rules are effectively that say, what classification of content is appropriate for to be located in the cloud versus perhaps a smaller on-premise deployment. And make sure that the user population understand that. So that's something that we really need to think about up front.
So as an example, we have some financial institutions, we have some pharmaceutical companies, and there are data that's so critical for them that they would never move that data outside of their control. But then there are like collaboration, more public, more semi-public or not so business-critical data which makes sense to run in the cloud. So what we've seen is that, like Spen said, we see that customers are moving certain workloads to the cloud, but then they're keeping some materials on their on-premises environment again, because again.
Same thing for like regions as well. There might be legislation that says data related to the formula for whatever, some magic product is not allowed to leave the country. Right? That'd certainly be the case for a lot of the UK banking industry, for example. So that's another example of a business driving, a business requirement driving, functional requirement driving where the content is located.
And the same thing is if you're a healthcare provider, there's typically strict regulations on where that data is allowed to live. Is it even allowed to live outside of your data center or not? And one thing that I don't have the slides, but actually is pretty key thing to realize that we actually, for our European customers, we have the EU data safe harbor clause that actually we can guarantee to our European customers that the data on Office 365 will always remain within the European Union, which is a big thing. It's a thing that we introduced based on actually quite a lot of pressure especially from German customers, because the German customers really feared the Patriot Act and the power that actually the US government has over US organizations. But with the EU, with that statement, actually we can guarantee that your data will reside within the EU. And some of the other cloud providers cannot guarantee that. So there are countries where certain cloud providers are illegal to use because of this, because you can't guarantee that the data actually resides within the European Union. So that was kind of the big picture how the environment is built. So if we start to dig a bit deeper, so how do we then do authentication and authorization in the cloud? So I think we'll do this piece and then break for lunch.
Yeah, so we'll perhaps run up to the end of the slides for this and then break for lunch
in
20 minutes.
So in Office 365, there's 3 ways to authenticate against the environment. So you have the cloud identities. So you have identities which you would create using the portal, add them. Then you have the one which is more interesting for enterprises, the federated identity, where actually you are logging on using your corporate credentials, and you're logging on against your own AD to access the service.
Yes.
And then there's the third category, which is extranet type of access.
Yeah, so over here, what this actually says is, user at litwareinc on Microsoft.com. And so in our example, that would be ISC London on Microsoft.com. And, that's fine if you don't have anything else on the smallest plans, but of course we don't, generally speaking, we don't want users to have to remember another username and another password in order to be able to use the service. Yeah. Hence the federation scenario here.
So the easy one, so again, with the online IDs, again, the users only exist in the cloud. So then there's another option where we can actually use the online identities, but we do synchronization of user information from the AD to the cloud. So we actually do a directory synchronization that actually then reads information from our on-premises Active Directory, talks to the provisioning service in the cloud, and then provisions these users into the directory store that we have in the cloud. And then the third, so you actually have a user that goes from the local AD and then into a specific organizational unit in the AD in the cloud. Then we have the third option where actually it is the same thing conceptually, that we actually copy the user from the local Active Directory to the cloud Active Directory. We're actually not copying passwords and anything like that. We're just copying the user object. And the reason why we do that is the server products that we have, Exchange, Link, and SharePoint, all actually require an Active Directory to work properly. So Exchange and Link use Active Directory as their address book, for instance. So in the scenario of the federated ID, so we synchronize the users, but then we have an ADFS instance on premises, and then there's an ADFS trust between the cloud and the ADFS provider. And then when a user logs in, the federation gateway knows from which realm the user came. It'll redirect the user back to the home realm so that they can authenticate against their own AD.
So key thing to take away here is, obviously in the first scenario, I haven't had to do anything over here. And for the next 2 scenarios, that's involving us doing some work here in our on-premise environment to make this all hang together.
Yes. So the end user experience again, so with the online ID, it's a different username and password, so you log on using that user ID. So you'll typically end up in a scenario where you have your corporate credentials and then you have your cloud credentials. So you get the prompts. So again, for certain scenarios, again, if you don't have an AD, that's actually, then you don't have any local credentials anyway. So it actually makes sense for certain scenarios. And if you want to quickly just set up a collaboration environment for sort of collaborating with some external parties for a project, you could actually just use this to complement your normal environment. Whereas then in the federated scenario, the end user logs in using their corporate IDs. However, they log on using their UPNs, not using domain /username. And we'll come back into that in more detail later. So the authentication happens on premises. So the benefit, again, you don't have to remember 2 sets of credentials, 2 sets of passwords. So you get real single sign-on experience. So for the end user, the federated IDs are obviously much better. Then for the IT administrators, again, if you think of the online ID, the challenge is that then you actually have to maintain a user in 2 places. So if the user does something bad and you have to fire him, you have to remember to go and remove them from the online directory as well. And also, since it's 2 separate passwords, there's 2 separate mechanisms for resetting passwords. And again, for IT pros with the federated approach, well, we do require the directory synchronization. We do require the ADFS. However, we can manage the password policies on premises. So by default, the password policies in the cloud expire every 90 days. So that actually typically leads into to people just writing down their passwords, because remembering new passwords is just a pain. So with Federated, actually, your corporate password policy is the same as the cloud. If you need to do a password reset, it's the same process that you do on premises. Call help desk, or if you have FIM, the password reset the capability of FIM, just use that. Also with Federated IDs, you have richer capabilities, so if you need two-factor authentication, it can be done. We cannot do two-factor authentication with a cloud. But again, those capabilities require some software some servers to be deployed to the environment. And actually we come back in more detail on what we actually need and how we set those things up in following slides. So if we think, when should you use what? Again, the online IDs, if you don't have an AD, there's no point of trying to synchronizing it because you don't have anything to synchronize. So for small organizations, the online IDs are perfectly fine. The benefits, you don't need anything deployed on premises. Again, the downside, no real single sign-on, you get prompted in the cloud. So and then you have to remember you have to manage the users in the cloud rather than on premises. Then I actually don't see the second one that often, where you had synchronization and still using the cloud IDs. There are scenarios where you're doing like mergers and acquisitions that can be a sort of a transitional phase that you would use that until if you're doing, let's say, AD remediation work or doing Forss consolidation, so you could intermediately use that, and then when you're ready, you would go into the third bucket, which is actually where you have an AD and you want to actually use your AD credentials, and you want to ensure that you have the control on your side on when to use what type of credentials and how to manage them.
Yeah, certainly for the enterprise, the Federation scenario, option 3 is definitely, could be considered a recommendation, right? If you think about it from a more high-level perspective, we're making a long-term commitment to the cloud, then these pros become pretty important to us, especially coexistence and also maybe interacting with other partner organizations and so on. So thinking a bit wider than just our company and Office 365. So the cons are overplayed to a certain extent because either of 2 or 3 need work done, need a server of some description in play. So yeah, as Kimmo said, the Federation scenario is definitely the most appropriate and the most common for
and it opens up, if you have other sort of line of business integration needs, it opens up, then you'll have the ADFS infrastructure in place already, because you can use the same infrastructure for more than just Office 365.
Thank you. So in terms of identity federation, there's a key consideration here is that, as Kimmo showed you in the animation, that identity is shared effectively from the end user's perspective. And so it does require a trust between the security token service that runs as part of the cloud and the on-premise STS, which will be the ADFS server that we deploy. And this will give end user single sign-in capability. They're not going to really need to know anything about this happening behind the scenes. They don't need to worry about URLs and passwords and so on. One set of credentials to remember, but also really one set of credentials to manage. And this cannot be overplayed. It's not just things like password resets, but it's also things like the guy that leaves there was a chap here that misplaced secure ID fob. It's that kind of management challenges that also impact here. And of course, the con is the one that we've just said is kind of a little bit overplayed in terms of, we need that ADFS box up and running. We should probably think about high availability for that, because if you just stick in a single ADFS server, and that guy gets some Windows updates applied to it or something like that, then your cloud sign-in is going to fail, obviously. So let's see, it's seen and perceived as being a complex, advanced IT pro area, but it's not really true. It's really quite straightforward. you know, it's obviously not the kind of thing that the small business is going to have the IT capability to do. The larger enterprise, it's, you know, should be fairly straightforward for them to get those skills in place to be able to deploy that stuff. So, you know, this diagram basically represents the federation scenario specific to Office 365, but it's really the same as any other federation scenario. We have our ADFS inside the company on-premise. We've already configured the DearSync capability, which is, again, as the animation previously talked to, is effectively copying the identity, not the credentials, just the identity into the Office 365 identity services bucket. This is what we kind of mentioned earlier in the week when we were talking about user profiles and the technology choices there. You know, this subsystem, there's a few more things to it than the boxes, but you know, it's all the same technology that we saw with user profiles there. And then the ADFS has a trust, basically. Oh, hello, Tobias. And there's a, you know, the proxy is managing the relationship between them. And then, of course, all of the services that hang off the back of that identity will be able to leverage the user identity. Now, you know, there's the free there, and of course, again, that could be many other things. Now, it's also worth pointing out that there's nothing, you know, we've only got one of these, right? But there could be three of them. Or there could be some other trust between Litware and Contoso. They might be in a partnership. And all of these things are possible because we've already got the deployment of ADFS here. So once we have that, it opens up a lot of other interesting scenarios for us.
Yeah, our requirement is that you need to have an ADFS 2.0 installation, but then what happens beyond that, we really don't care. So if your ADFS is just a gateway to another federation service, we don't really care.
Yeah. And, you know, anything we wanted to do on-premise that leverages that, say we might want to do certificate-based authentication to SharePoint and so on, you know, of course we can reuse that, those machines there. So we have effectively two approaches here, passive authentication and one that's based on a proxy trust. So in this example, you know, obviously we have our client machine which is joined to, you know, the company's domain, right? So this is an interactive logon scenario. And, you know, obviously we've signed in. And then it's the ADFS server which is then going to present the correct or understands the realm of sign-in. We'll speak to the Federation gateway in the cloud, pass the token back, and then the identity can be used to log on to all the other services. So it's fairly straightforward, but it kind of limits us to this domain join scenario effectively. Which might work well for the classic sort of old-fashioned corporate desktop deployment model, but perhaps not as flexible as we might want going forward, especially if we start thinking about phones and tablets and other new things that have yet to be
people working
introduced.
From cafeterias and like sitting in Starbucks and drinking mediocre coffee and working. So
yeah. So then, oh, I didn't realize that. Whee! He's having fun. He was at the party last night.
Yeah.
Sorry. That's what I just said.
Yes, it was.
Anyway, and then we have a concept of active authentication, and this is slightly different. So at this point, you know, whether we're joined to the domain or not, you know, we could be on a console or sorry, a terminal access, that kind of thing. We're going to speak to the Federation gateway, then we'll speak to ADFS. That'll do the authentication. Just validate that at the Federation gateway, and then we can go ahead and authenticate, or indeed browse access. And that's, you know, it says Exchange there, but that could be SharePoint, link, whatever. And I would certainly think this would be suggested as the ideal approach.
Yeah. And this is also like the the other difference between the active and passive authentication. So passive are clients that are capable of understanding a redirect. So they will get a browser. So typical example with a browser, they get a 3 or 4, so they get redirected to the right place. Whereas the active ones are clients like Outlook. So you'll have actually authentication happening on behalf of you. So works in a different way. The browser and the rich clients work in a different way.
Yeah, you can consider the active authentication to be similar to pre-authentication in a classic reverse proxy scenario. It's very similar to that.
Going back to the previous slide, if the user is outside your premises, coming from a cafe or somewhere, how would they authenticate?
So if you're an external, like not in the corporate domain, so if you're coming, so usually you would actually augment this by introducing an ADFS proxy, which would be the internet-facing part. And we'll have slides on that in more detail after lunch. So you would actually, because you should not expose your ADFS server directly to the internet. You should rather expose the proxy to the internet. So in your scenario, you would talk to the proxy that would talk to the server, the ADFS server.
Yeah, that proxy would, if they didn't have creds, it would prompt them effectively with a forms-based.
That means you need to open up firewall pools coming into it.
No. It's all done over the universal firewall bypass protocol, right?
Yes.
443.
Yes.
We also mentioned earlier additional multi-factor authentication, as I like to call it. So not just username, password, but also something else. That might be a one-time SMS message, a secure ID fob, those kind of things. So this, basically requires ADFS for SharePoint anyway, right? If we want to do multi-factor authentication, we require the deployment of ADFS or another similar authentication federation product, and we will be able to customize the ADFS logon page to include the additional aspects. So it might be the one-time phrase that you get over SMS and so on. So we get we can leverage this once we have already done the previous steps to deploy ADFS.
One limitation today with Office 365 is that we cannot do multi-factor authentication using the Outlook client. The Outlook client is not capable of doing that, but the browsers and the other clients are. So.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because there's some reasonably small company that make a personal computing device that apparently doesn't work very well with certificates. But anyway, it's a topic for later maybe.
So should we actually?
Yes, I think it's just gone half past the hour.
Yeah,
so
let's take this slide and then break for lunch. So as a summary, depending on what type of ID you use and what client you use, you'll get different type of single sign-on experience. So again, with the online IDs, for each of the different, so your link online, your Outlook, OWA, SharePoint, your Office clients, each session will need to authenticate. And then the session will store a persistent cookie that you will then use for subsequent requests as long as that session is open. So for ActiveSync, POP, IMAP, and Entourage clients, you will need to specify the credentials during setup time. And then when the passwords expire, you'll have to reset them. So again, with domain joins, again, you'll get link online, you'll get automatically signed in, no prompts for Outlook web application or and the same thing would then be for Office and for Outlook. So each session will need to do the credentials. So again, the single sign-on IDs were not germane. Again, each session. So you'll see that in reality, regardless if you're if you're domain joined, because you can then do the pre-authentication, so we know who you are, so you won't do that. So if you're not domain joined, we need to get that validation. So that's why you'll get, for each session, you'll actually get a prompt, and what you will be prompted for are your AD credentials. So obviously there's benefits in having a domain joined machine, but actually it's only for the two where you're using SharePoint or if you're using Link. If you're using Outlook, you'll get the first prompt. Okay. And again, in Outlook, so when you log on to Office 365, the first time you get a prompt, and then there's this checkbox that store password, right? So it can encrypt that, so it'll use that until the next. So we have customers who have group policies who've disabled that. For them, they'll have to enter the prompt multiple times. So with Outlook, it's not a true single sign-on experience.
Yeah, and remember in the active sign-on scenario, this is pretty important. We have to install components on the client machines to enable this rich client support. So, the more of those clients you have, the more work that's going to be.
Yes.
It's a non-trivial task to push out these proxy components to 250,000 workstations. Well, it's actually technically very easy to do,
Yes.
but in reality, it becomes a painful thing to think about. So, key planning consideration is where you need to do that, when you're going to do it, and how you bring that online effectively with your user population.
And another thing is that for what we've seen to be the biggest project issue typically in the larger cloud projects is actually your desktop readiness. So it's too often that we suddenly see that, well, actually we have a department in Brazil that's still on Office 2003. Well, guess what? It won't work in the cloud. So there are desktop requirements that you have to meet. So, and again, the Office 365 desktop, it's a good component, but again, it needs to be installed. And if your local users aren't local admins, then you need to have a way for centralize it to deploy them. So using group policies or some other mechanisms. But again, there are considerations. So the cloud is not just take the elevator to the top roof and jump off to get to the cloud. It's actually you have to plan. There's work that needs to be done.
Yeah, so the journey to the cloud requires us to deal with two persistent problems that we've had for many years, and it doesn't change any of that, right? So our identity management and our client software.
Yes.